It is a night in the autumn of 64 AD, and you're standing in a garden on the western bank of the Tiber on a hill the Romans call the Vatican. The garden belongs to the emperor. It is enormous, and tonight, for the first time anyone can remember, it has been open to the public. Hundreds of ordinary citizens have crossed the wooden bridge from the ruined city, past the great obelisk brought from Egypt into grounds that only aristocrats have ever seen. They have come because of the lights. Along the pathways between the fountains, along the edge of the long reflecting pool, along the route the imperial chariot will take, stand rows of wooden posts. On the posts are human figures. Some of them are still moving. The man who owns this garden is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 26 years old, Emperor of Rome for 10 years. He is here tonight somewhere in the crowd, dressed not as an emperor, but as a professional chariot racer, a cup of wine in his hand, greeting his guests by name. The figures' music on the posts are members of a small religious sect from the eastern provinces. Their neighbors' music, call them Christians. They have been coated in pitch. They have been fixed, music, to the wood. And when the emperor gives the signal, a slave will walk the pathway with a torch and light them one after another, so that the garden glows for his party after dark. Understand what this night is not. It is not the story of a mad emperor who burned people because he enjoyed it. It is the story of what an empire does when it needs someone to blame. 3 months earlier, Rome burned for 9 days. 10 of the city's 14 districts were damaged. 3 were erased to bare ground. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes in a single week. And in the ash of the ruined streets, a rumor began to move, whispered from doorway to doorway that the fire had not been an accident. The rumor said the emperor himself had ordered it to clear space for the palace he had been dreaming of for years. The men burning on these posts are not being music punished for what they did. They are being punished for what the crowd believes Nero did. And here is what no one in this garden music can know. Within 18 months, a tent maker named Paul will be beheaded on a road music south of this city. A fisherman named Simon called Peter will be crucified upside down on these very grounds. Within 4 years, the emperor music hosting this party will cut his own throat in a villa outside Rome. And within 3 centuries, the religion he is trying to burn out of existence tonight will become music, the official religion of his empire. The garden you are standing in will vanish under a cemetery, then under a basilica, then under the largest church ever built by human beings. The ground beneath your feet is the ground the Vatican stands on today. And directly under its high altar, in a small hollow in an ancient wall, their music are bones. But to understand how a party became the founding trauma of the largest religious movement in human history, you have to go back 3 months to a hot night in July and a row of wooden shops beneath the Circus Maximus. The fire started on the night of the 18th of July, 64 AD, in the shops packed against the outer wall of the great racing stadium. Rome in summer was kindling, music, a city of wooden tenements 4 and 5 stories tall, leaning into narrow streets, sharing walls, drying in the heat. What was not common was the wind that night. Within hours, the flames had climbed the Palatine. By dawn, they had jumped the streets of the Aventine. The fire burned for 6 days before music firefighters, tearing down whole neighborhoods to starve it, finally contained it. Then on the 7th day, it started again in a different district in a warehouse. And the warehouse belonged to Aphonius Tigellinus, the commander of the emperor's own guard. Nero was 30 miles away music, at his villa in Antium when it began, and the record says he did not move until word arrived that the flames had reached his own palace. It burned before he could get there. To his credit, he spent the next 2 weeks music working. He opened the field of Mars in his private gardens to the homeless, released grain from the imperial reserves, and built emergency shelters on the very Vatican grounds where the executions would later take place. It was competent crisis management. It should have saved his reputation. It did not, because within days a story began circulating through the refugee camps. And the story was specific. It said that while Rome burned, the emperor had climbed to a palace rooftop in stage costume, taken up his lyre, and sung of the burning of Troy, while his capital music turned to ash below him. Whether he did it almost does not matter. 3 separate historians preserved the story independently, which proves one thing for certain. Rome believed it. Then Nero made the belief permanent. Within weeks before the ash had cooled, he announced a new palace on exactly the ground the fire had cleared. 3 entire districts. He gave it a name that survives in the record. The Doi Zora, the Golden House. It would hold an artificial lake, a forest inside the city walls, and a bronze statue of Nero as the sun god, 120 foot tall. The people of Rome looked at the plans, looked at the ash, and drew their conclusion. The crowd's fury now had a target. The emperor could music, not survive. It needed a new one. And in the last weeks of that summer, his advisors found it. They found it in a small sect that had arrived from the province of Judea about 20 years earlier. And the disturbing detail is this. The state already had files on them. 15 years before the fire, the Emperor Claudius had expelled troublemakers from Rome over constant disturbances instigated, the record music, says, by a man named Chrestus. The Clare almost certainly misheard the name. The disturbances were fights in the synagogues of Rome over a crucified preacher from Nazareth, whose followers claimed he had risen from the dead. By 49 AD, this movement was already visible enough that an emperor had put his seal on a document about it. The exiles drifted back after Claudius' music died. And by 60 AD, their most dangerous voice was living openly in the capital. Paul of Tarsus' music arrived in Rome under house arrest and spent 2 years in a rented apartment guarded by a single soldier receiving visitors, teaching, music, writing letters that were copied and carried across the empire. The authorities knew his address, and in one music letter written from that apartment, Paul makes a claim that should have alarmed every official who heard it. He says his message has reached into Caesar's own household. He does not say who. He does not need to. Rome tolerated foreign gods. It asked only 2 things in return. Keep the public peace and when required offer sacrifice to the deified emperor. The Christians could not do the second and to a Roman magistrate. That refusal was not theology. It was disloyalty to the state. Refused in public on principle. But there was something worse. They met at night behind closed doors for a ritual meal. They greeted each other with a kiss and they spoke in words their neighbors could overhear of eating the body and drinking the blood of their founder. Out of those fragments, Roman society built its accusations and repeated them for a generation. Cannibalism, incest, hatred of the human race. One historian writing from imperial records now lost preserved the phrase the authorities' music, used for them that autumn, a class hated for their abominations. He did not explain music, what the abominations were. His readers had grown up hearing the rumors. When the state needed a category of people the crowd would allow to burn, the ground had been prepared for years. The soldiers came in the autumn and the record preserves the procedure which is the coldest part of music the story. First a handful of arrests, then interrogations designed to produce names. Those named were arrested and music interrogated for more names, and the circle widened house by house until the record describes the number seized with 2 words. An enormous multitude. No source preserves the music count. The community in Rome likely numbered a few thousand at most, which means the sweep may have taken a substantial fraction of every Christian in the city. What happened to them next was designed to be watched. The record preserves 3 methods. Some were sewn into the fresh skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Some were nailed to crosses, the death row reserved for slaves and the lowest criminals, and some were held back for the evening. Those were coated in pitch, bound to wooden posts in the imperial gardens, and lit after dark. The record uses a precise phrase for this last group. Nocturnal illumination. It is not a metaphor. It is an engineering description. The condemned were the lighting for the party. Nero opened the gates and the crowd came. The homeless of Rome walked the pathways of the imperial estate while the post's music flared along the water and the emperor moved among them in his racing colors, drove his own chariot around the illuminated circuit and offered the spectacle music as a gift. Here are your arsonists, the evening said. Your emperor punishes them in his own garden for you. And then something happened that Nero had not planned for. The record preserves the crowd's reaction, and it was not gratitude. Watching the burning, even a crowd raised to despise these people, began to feel something the emperor had not ordered. Pity a sense. The record says that these victims were being destroyed not for the public good, but to feed the cruelty of one man. The spectacle music built to move the crowd's rage away from Nero was quietly moving more of it music toward him. And the killing did not stop because among those still alive in imperial custody that autumn were 2 men whose deaths would matter more than the emperor's entire music reign. One was a fisherman, one was a tent maker. And the ground where they died music is the reason this story never ended. What you are watching is reconstructed from a single Roman passage. One letter written by a survivor's generation and the physical music ground of the Vatican itself. The Roman sources are contaminated. The Christian sources are devoted. This channel builds every documentary from what the record actually preserves and from where the stones can still be checked. If that is the kind of history you want, subscribe before the fisherman is crucified. Remember what Tacitus preserved? The crowd came to Nero's garden expecting to see justice done to the arsonists who had burned their homes. What they saw instead was theater. And theater is what Peter walked into when the imperial soldiers came for him. The fisherman was Simon of Bethsaida, called Peter, called Music, the Rock. He arrived in Rome sometime in the early 60s AD, and a letter written under his name hints at his location with a single coded word. He says he is writing from Babylon. His readers understood Babylon meant the city that ruled the world. It meant Rome. He was there when the arrests began. And the earliest surviving Christian voices, one writing from Rome itself only 30 years later, agree on what happened to him. He was seized in the persecution and crucified on the Vatican grounds. A later tradition adds a detail the earliest sources do not, that he asked to be nailed upside down, unworthy to die in the posture of his teacher. Whether that detail is memory or devotion, the core fact stands in the oldest records we have. The fisherman died on the hill. The killing settled into routine that winter. Survivors of the garden were fed into the arena in small groups in the ordinary morning executions. Some died privately, some bought their lives with names. The community stopped meeting in daylight, and the letters written to these scattered congregations in the following years read like instructions for music, living under a state that wants you dead. Paul heard the knock. The tradition preserved from the earliest sources says he was executed on the Ostian road south of the city, and the manner of his death turns on a single legal detail. Paul was a Roman citizen, and the law forbade crucifying citizens. So the man who had lived as a music foreigner everywhere was granted the one privilege of his citizenship at the end of it, a sword instead of a cross. They walked him out, music, past the walls as the law required, and beheaded him on the road to the sea. His followers buried him nearby. They marked the grave. Remember that they marked it. It will matter more than anything else in this story. Nero, meanwhile, built. By 68 AD, the Golden House stood across the ground the fire had cleared. Music, and the record preserves what he said when he walked through it. At last, he said, I can begin to live like a human being. He had 4 years left. Hold his 120-foot bronze colossus in your mind. Because within 12 years of his death, Music, his successors would drain his lake and raise a stone amphitheater on its bed. A deliberate gift returning stolen ground to the Roman people. The world calls it the Colosseum. It stands on Nero's drained lake to Music this day. Rome did not merely replace Nero. Rome erased him building by building. And yet the one thing his reign could not erase was the thing Music it had tried hardest to destroy. To understand why, you have to look at what a scholar found in the Latin itself 19.5 centuries Music later. Because the most famous passage in this entire story may hide a problem. In 2015, a Princeton classicist named Brent Shaw published 70 pages of forensic analysis Music in one of the most rigorous journals in the field. And his conclusion detonated quietly through the discipline. The famous passage describing the human torches. The single most quoted piece of Latin in early Christian history may not have Music been written by the Roman historian at all. It may have been inserted centuries later by Christian hands in the monasteries where the manuscripts were Music copied. His evidence was in the language, sure catalogue specific ways, Music. The passage differs from the historian's own Latin and points to distinctions, Music. It draws between Jews and Christians that did not yet exist in 64 AD. And there is one absence that is Music, hard to explain away. Another Roman writer produced a full biography of Nero, a biography Music, that recorded his crimes with appetite. It mentions punishment of Christians in a single dry line. It never mentions the torches. Music, it never mentions the garden. The most sensational atrocity of the reign Music, missing from the writer who never missed an atrocity. Other scholars, Music, fired back. Serious voices. Christopher Jones among them defended the passage line by line, and most classicists today still accept it as genuine. While Candida Moss had already argued that the whole tradition of early martyrdom grew in the telling. The debate has not resolved. The honest position is the uncomfortable one. Something happened in Rome in 64 AD Music, and the community believed its people had been killed by the state. Because the survivors' own letters carry the bruise. What cannot be fully verified is the burning garden itself. But here is what no historian on any side music disputes. Peter and Paul both died in Rome under Nero at the hands of the Roman state. Their graves were marked, remembered, and visited at two specific spots that never moved. Strip away every contested sentence and you are left with geography. The Vatican Hill, the Ostian Road, two graves. Nero did not live to see what grew from them. In June of 68 AD, the legions revolted. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state and he fled to a villa outside the city where, unable to make his own hand move, he forced a blade into his throat music, with the help of a secretary. He was 30 years old. The record preserves his final words. "What an artist dies with me. The persecution died with him." Music, and within a generation, pilgrims were coming quietly, illegally to stand at music, a particular spot in an ordinary cemetery on the Vatican Hill. Remember what Nero opened his gardens for on the Vatican in the autumn of 64 AD. Remember the illuminated pathway between the fountains? Christians in Rome remembered it for the next 140 years until they were finally able to build a small stone monument on the exact ground where the fisherman had died. That monument is where the story stops being about what Nero did and starts being about what the ground itself became. Around 200 AD, a Christian named Gas wrote a letter that survives. And in it, he offers to show a rival something with his own eyes. He calls it the Trophy of Peter standing on the Vatican. A physical monument, a marker over a grave. Music, his letter sat in the record for over 17 centuries, a claim no one could check. Then in 1939, someone checked. That year, workmen preparing a tomb for a dead pope beneath the floor music of St. Peter's Basilica broke through into open space, and Pope Pius XII made a decision no pope had dared make before. He ordered a full excavation beneath the high altar of the largest church in Music Christricendum. For 10 years through the Second World War, through the German occupation of Rome, archaeologists tunneled in secret beneath the Basilica, Music, while soldiers walked the square above them. What they found descending through the floor was a buried street of the dead. An entire Roman cemetery Moralum after Moslem, sealed underground and intact Music. Since the 4th century, when the first basilica's builders had cut off the roofs and filled the tombs with earth to level the hillside. The excavators walked down a Roman burial street no living person had seen in 1600 years. And at its western end, directly beneath the high altar, aligned under the exact center of Michelangelo's dome, they found a small nicked monument built into a red plastered wall, dated by the brick stamps around Music, it to roughly 160 A. It matched the description in Gas's letter, the Trophy of Peter, standing precisely where a man in 200 AD said it stood. And inside a hollow of the wall beside it, there were bones. They were lifted in 1942 and set aside. Music, and then something strange happened. Nothing. The Pope announced in 1950 that the tomb of Peter had been found, but said the bones could not be confirmed. They sat in storage while a scholar named Margherita Guiducci spent years reconstructing what had been disturbed. Music, and what she assembled was this. The bones belonged to one man 60 to 70 years old at death of robust build about 5 feet 7 inches in tall. They were wrapped in purple cloth threaded with gold. The burial covering of someone held in the highest honor and the feet Music are missing. Every bone of both feet absent. Those who believe have an explanation. A man crucified upside down is removed from the cross fastest by cutting through the ankles. In 1968, Music Pope Paul V/VI announced the bones were in the Vatican's careful wording, identified in a manner it considers convincing, not proven. The Vatican itself has never claimed proof. When Pope Francis displayed Music, the bones publicly in 2013, the claim remained what it had always been, believed, not certain, but stand back from the bones because the certainty was never in the bones. It is in the ground. A monument raised around Music 160 AD, when people whose grandparents were alive in 64 AD could still object to a lie. A basilica built over that exact Music monument by Constantine in the 4th century. Its builders leveling a hillside and burying a cemetery rather than move the altar even a few feet sideways. A second basilica built over the first in the 16th century. Its high altar in the same place. Michelangelo's dome centered on the same point. Today the Pope says Mass directly above the niche in the red wall. The entire Vatican, the Piazza, the palace, the smallest sovereign state on earth established by the Lateran Music Treaty of 1929 at 109 acres, radiates outward music from that single spot. And that spot sits inside the footprint of what was on a night in the autumn of 64 AD Nero's garden. The emperor lit his party with burning Christians to save his throne. And the exact ground of the party became the music capital of a faith that today counts 1.5 billion people. More than the Roman Empire governed in its entire history. He built the scapegoat, a kingdom. What remains music of each of them is the final ledger. Nero was buried by his nurse and a former mistress in his father's family tomb on the Pinion Hill. The tomb is gone. Medieval Romans believed his ghost haunted the ground and a church was raised over it to seal it. Santa Maria dell'Oppo, which stands, music, there now. His golden house was stripped, filled with rubble and buried until a young Roman in the 1400s fell through a hole in a hillside and landed music, in a room covered in painted figures. Artists lowered themselves in on ropes to copy the walls by torchlight. One of them was Raphael. His Colossus, music, was melted down for scrap. Not one intact monument of his reign stands in Rome under his own name. Paul lies where they buried him. Beneath the altar of the Basilica on the Ostian Road, excavators in the early 2000s uncovered a Roman sarcophagus and above it a 4th century marble slab carrying 3 Latin words. Paceless Apostolus Mart. Paul, Apostle Martyr. In 2009, the Vatican announced that bone fragments drawn from inside it had been carbon dated to the 1st or 2nd century AD. You can see the sarcophagus today through a window in the basilica floor. And on the Vatican Hill, under the high altar, behind bronze doors in a hollow of a red plastered wall, the bones of a heavy-set man of about 65, wrapped in purple and gold, missing his feet, rest at the geometric center of the largest church human beings have ever built. Above him, Bernini's bronze canopy. Above that, Michelangelo's dome. Above that, the sky over the hill where the posts once stood along the water. Almost nothing of the emperor survives. Almost everything of the fisherman is still standing on the same ground. 249 years after Nero's garden party, another emperor would try again. Diocletian's persecution would last 10 years and kill more Christians than every earlier persecution combined. It ended when a Roman general standing outside the walls of Rome in 312 AD saw something in the sky that made him surrender his empire to the religion it had spent centuries trying to kill. What Constantine saw and what it cost the world is a different kind of story, and it is on this.